The Galactic Transit Authority had, in its infinite and highly documented wisdom, established exactly 47,062 protocols for deep space emergencies. There were procedures for hull breaches, antimatter containment failures, navigational array collapses, diplomatic incidents involving tentacled species, and even the oddly specific scenario of unexpected temporal displacement during breakfast service. What the GTA had not anticipated, primarily because it seemed absurdly primitive to even consider, was the complete and catastrophic failure of food replication systems, combined with the total destruction of emergency ration supplies on an uncharted planet with breathable atmosphere and liquid water. This oversight was about to become very, very relevant. See, the thing about civilized space travel was that it had become so remarkably safe, so thoroughly sanitized, that most species had forgotten what their ancestors did before someone invented the convenient little box that transformed energy into nutritionally complete meal cubes. The Corinthians had been synthesizing their sustenance for 3,000 years. The Boreans for 5,000. The Grelics had never known anything else, having achieved spaceflight and molecular gastronomy in the same decade, which their philosophers considered a point of racial pride. Humans had been doing it for about 70 years, give or take, and most of them still thought replicator food tasted like salted cardboard wrapped in disappointment. This difference in perspective was about to save 4 lives, though the 3 non-human lives in question weren't going to enjoy the process. The ship had gone down hard on a planet that hadn't even earned a proper designation yet, just a catalog number that translated roughly to watery rock, oxygen present, probably boring. The initial assessment proved 2/3 accurate. It was indeed watery and oxygen-rich. The boring part was currently being revised in real time as the 4-person research crew crawled from the wreckage and took stock of their situation. Vexthol, the Corinthian navigator whose species resembled what might happen if a praying mantis decided to go upright and invest heavily in crystalline neural structures, picked himself up with the kind of dignity that only comes from having 3 parallel brains to distribute the panic across. His compound eyes swept across the crash site with methodical precision, cataloguing damage with the sort of calm that suggested he was either very professional or very much in shock. Probably both. Quillix emerged next, unfurling her 6 limbs with a groan that resonated through frequencies most species couldn't hear. The Borean scientist looked like someone had given a starfish ambitions and a doctoral degree in xenobiology. Her bioluminescent patches flickered erratically, the equivalent of a human's eye twitching, as she assessed the crumpled remains of their research vessel. Thum, the Grelic engineer, simply oozed out of the emergency hatch, his gelatinous form rippling with what might have been distress or might have been his species' version of stretching. It was always hard to tell with Grelics. They were essentially sentient pudding that had somehow mastered quantum mechanics, and their emotional states were notoriously difficult to read unless you had a chemistry degree and a spectral analyzer. Marcus Webb climbed out last, the human xenobiologist, looking significantly more rumpled than his colleagues, but moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd seen worse. He'd once been stranded in the Amazon for 6 days due to a helicopter malfunction. Before that, 3 weeks in the Australian outback because of spectacularly poor planning. The universe kept putting Marcus in survival situations, and he kept surviving them with what his colleagues considered either remarkable competence or dumb luck. Usually both. Damage assessment, Vexthol clicked, his translator converting the statement into something the others could process. The primary reactor is stable, but the navigation systems are completely destroyed. Communication array is functional, but we're in a dead zone. The earliest rescue window is 48 hours, assuming our distress beacon reaches the relay station. Food supplies. Quillix's question carried harmonics of concern. Thum rippled over to the cargo bay, or what remained of it, and spent several minutes analyzing the wreckage with appendages that formed and dissolved as needed. When he finally responded, his translator crackled with static that suggested even the device was uncomfortable delivering the news. Replicator unit is catastrophically compromised. Emergency rations were stored in the aft compartment, which is currently distributed across approximately half a kilometer of landscape. Also, they appear to be on fire. There was a moment of silence punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shoreline about 50 meters from the crash site and the distant crackling of burning provisions. "Well," Marcus said, shoving his hands into his pockets and surveying the landscape with the air of someone evaluating a mildly inconvenient situation rather than a potential death sentence, "that's not ideal." Vexthal's crystalline structures refracted light in a pattern that indicated extreme stress. "Not ideal. We have no sustenance, we're stranded on an uncharted world, and rescue is 2 standard cycles away. My species can survive approximately 30 hours without nutritional intake before experiencing cascade organ failure. This is significantly more severe than not ideal. 42 hours for Boreans," Quillix added, her bioluminescence dimming to a worried amber. "Though consciousness becomes impaired after 30. I can metabolize my own cellular structure for approximately 60 hours, Thum offered, somehow managing to sound both helpful and depressed. "However, the resulting intelligence degradation would likely render me useless for complex problem-solving after the first day." All 3 aliens turned to look at Marcus with the sort of expectant hope that suggested they believed humans might have some remarkable biological advantage in the starvation department. "Yeah, I'll be pretty hungry by then too," Marcus said, crushing those hopes with admirable efficiency. "Humans get really unpleasant after about 3 days without food, irritable, weak, prone to making poor decisions and eating things we shouldn't. It's a whole thing." Vexthal's posture shifted into what his species considered a dignified acceptance of fate. "Then we shall simply have to hope that rescue arrives within the viable window. I suggest we focus on shelter construction and distress signal amplification." "Agreed," Quillix pulsed. "A logical application of our remaining time and resources." Marcus looked at his colleagues, then at the crystal-clear water stretching out before them, then at the alien landscape with its clusters of vegetation and the distant calls of what were probably birds or the local equivalent. "Right," he said slowly. "You 3 work on that. I'm going to take a walk." "A walk?" Vexthal's translator actually managed to convey incredulity. "We're facing a survival crisis, and you want to engage in recreational ambulation." "Something like that," Marcus replied, already heading toward the water. The thing about Marcus Webb was that he'd grown up in a family that considered wilderness survival camp an appropriate summer activity for children. His grandmother had taught him to fish at age 6. His father had shown him how to start a fire with sticks at 8, though Marcus had always suspected that was more about keeping him occupied than actual education. He'd spent his teenage years camping, hiking, and generally doing the sorts of things that civilized society had rendered mostly obsolete, but that some humans still did, because it felt right on some deep ancestral level. The galactic community found this baffling. Why would an advanced species voluntarily subject themselves to primitive conditions? For fun? Marcus didn't bother trying to explain anymore. Let them think humans were weird. They were right, after all. He walked along the shoreline, eyes scanning the water with practiced assessment. The planet's sun was setting, casting the kind of golden light that made everything look like a tourism advertisement. The water was clear enough to see shapes moving beneath the surface. Fish analogues, probably. Or maybe actual fish. Convergent evolution was wild like that. He found a tree that looked promising, broke off a straight branch about as thick as his thumb, and spent the next 20 minutes sharpening one end against a rock. The work was meditative, familiar. His colleagues were probably back at the crash site, having a philosophical discussion about mortality. Marcus was making a spear. Different coping mechanisms. The aliens found him an hour later, standing knee-deep in the water with perfect stillness, the sharpened stick held at ready. "What?" Quillix pulsed slowly. "Are you doing?" "Fishing," Marcus said without moving, eyes locked on the water. "Fishing," Vexthal repeated. "The act of extracting aquatic life forms from their natural habitat." "That's the one." Thum rippled forward, his mass undulating with confusion. "For what purpose?" "We have no analysis equipment to determine if local biology is compatible with our digestive systems. Even if we could process it, we have no means of rendering it into consumable form." Marcus said nothing, focused entirely on the shadow moving through the water in front of him. Then, in one smooth motion, he struck. The spear plunged into the water and came up with a fish-like creature wriggling on the end, about the size of his forearm and sporting fins that caught the fading light in iridescent flashes. It was, objectively, a pretty decent catch. "Huh," Marcus said with satisfaction. "Still got it." The three aliens stared at the impaled creature with varying degrees of horror. "You've killed it," Quillix observed, her bioluminescence shifting to a distinctly nauseous green. "Well, yeah," Marcus said, wading back to shore. "That's generally how this works. You three might want to step back." They didn't, primarily because none of them could quite believe what they were witnessing. This was their first real exposure to humanity's approach to survival, and it was proving educational in the way that natural disasters are educational. Marcus found a flat rock, dispatched the fish with quick efficiency that made Thum actually recoil, and began the process of cleaning it. His colleagues watched in fascinated revulsion as he worked, removing organs and scales with the kind of practiced competence that suggested he'd done this before, many times before. "This is barbaric," Vexthal announced, though his translator noted a curious subroutine running that suggested he was also recording everything for later analysis. "This is dinner," Marcus corrected. "Now, I need to build a fire." "Fire." Quillix's patches flickered rapidly, processing this new information. "You mean a sustained combustion reaction? Here, in open atmosphere? Unless you know a better way to cook fish." "Yeah." "Cook." Thum formed what might have been an approximation of a head to better express his confusion. "You're going to deliberately apply thermal energy to the organic tissue. That's what cooking is, buddy." Marcus set about gathering materials, collecting dry vegetation, and arranging stones in a circle, while his colleagues looked on like anthropologists observing a particularly bizarre ritual. He'd found some flint-like rocks near the crash site, and with a bit of work and some tinder from his pockets, because Marcus Webb always carried tinder, a habit his shipmates had previously mocked, he got a small flame going. The moment fire bloomed in the gathering darkness, all three aliens jumped back in alarm. "He's created uncontrolled exothermic oxidation." Vexthal's voice crackled with alarm. "It's very controlled, actually," Marcus said, feeding the small flame carefully. "That's kind of the whole point of civilization, right? Controlling fire. Our species moved past combustion-based energy systems millennia ago." Quillix protested, though she was edging closer despite herself, drawn by the warmth and light. "This is primitive." Primitive works when advanced technology is scattered across the landscape in a smoking crater, Marcus pointed out reasonably. He'd gotten a proper fire going now, flames dancing in the stone circle with cheerful disregard for galactic sophistication. Now watch this part. It's pretty neat. He'd found some green wood to make a rough frame and positioned the cleaned fish over the flames, supporting it on the makeshift structure. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkening sky, and the fish began to sizzle. The smell hit them first. Quillix's translator actually stuttered, trying to process her reaction. What is that sensory input? That's the smell of cooking fish, Marcus said. Proteins denaturing, fats rendering, all the good stuff happening. Thum had gone very still, which for a gelatinous being was saying something. My chemical sensors are detecting complex aromatic compounds, amino acid chains restructuring under thermal stress, lipid molecules breaking down into... He paused, his mass rippling in what might have been confusion or dawning hunger, into something my biology is registering as desirable. Yeah, that's the cooking, Marcus said, turning the fish carefully. Your bodies know food when they smell it, even if your brains are being weird about it. Vexthal was running scans with a handheld device he'd salvaged from the wreck, his crystalline structures refracting the firelight in dancing patterns. The thermal application is breaking down complex proteins into simpler amino acid chains. It's also destroying potential pathogens and parasites. This is actually logical from a biological safety perspective. Plus it tastes better, Marcus added. Well, usually. No guarantees on alien fish, but we're about to find out. The fish had reached a perfect golden brown, the skin crispy and the flesh flaking apart in the way that suggested it was cooked through. Marcus removed it from the heat, let it cool for a moment, then broke off a piece and ate it. His three colleagues watched with the intensity of scientists observing a potentially fatal experiment. Marcus chewed, considered, and swallowed. Not bad. Little bland without salt, but definitely edible. Tastes kind of like trout. You're consuming it, Quillix stated, her voice carrying undertones of disbelief. Without laboratory analysis, without toxicity screening, without knowing its biochemical compatibility with your physiology. That's how humans figured out what was edible in the first place, Marcus said, breaking off another piece. Someone had to try it first. Besides, my ancestors evolved to be pretty good at processing a wide variety of organic matter. Comes with being omnivorous persistence hunters who wandered into every ecosystem on their planet and decided to eat whatever looked interesting. Thum rippled closer to the fire, his mass drawn by the warmth and smell despite his obvious reservations. Your species determined dietary safety through trial and error. That seems inefficient. It worked though, Marcus pointed out. We're here, aren't we? Vexthal was still scanning, his devices processing the cooked fish's composition. My analysis indicates that the protein structure is remarkably similar to standard amino acid chains found in most carbon-based life forms. The thermal processing has indeed neutralized potential biological hazards. Theoretically, this could provide viable nutrition for all our species. Theoretically, Quillix pulsed nervously. Well, Marcus said, offering a piece toward Thum, theory's great and all, but you're going to starve in about 50 hours if we don't get practical. Your choice. The Grelic engineer formed a temporary appendage, took the offered fish with obvious reluctance, and absorbed it into his mass. There was a long moment where nothing happened, and then Thum's entire body rippled with what his species considered extreme surprise. This is acceptable, he said, sounding shocked. More than acceptable, My digestive processes are breaking it down efficiently. The thermal preparation has pre-processed the proteins in a way that actually makes consumption easier than raw organic matter. That was all the encouragement Quillix needed. Her bioluminescence shifted to curious yellow as she accepted a piece, manipulating it with delicate limb tips before consuming it. The resulting flash of surprised pink was so bright Marcus had to look away. "Oh," she pulsed. "Oh, this is extraordinary. The flavor compounds, the textural variation, her patches cycled through several colors rapidly. Why does thermally restructured tissue produce such pleasing sensory responses?" "Because cooking is one of humanity's greatest hits," Marcus said, grinning. "Right up there with the wheel and passive-aggressive emails." Even Vexthal, after considerable deliberation and several more scans, accepted a portion. His reaction was characteristically measured, but his crystalline structures definitely refracted light in patterns that suggested satisfaction. "This is significantly more palatable than our emergency rations ever were. The complexity of flavors created by the thermal process is remarkable. Just wait until I find some herbs," Marcus said, already planning his next foraging expedition. "If this planet has anything resembling wild onion or garlic, we're going to have a proper meal." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus caught 3 more fish and taught his colleagues the basics of fire management and cooking. Thum proved surprisingly adept at maintaining the fire once he got over his initial hesitation, his ability to extend and shape appendages making him excellent at arranging fuel. Quillix catalogued every aspect of the process with scientific enthusiasm, declaring it a primitive yet highly effective survival technology. Vexthal, ever practical, began calculating the caloric return on energy invested and concluded that Marcus's method was actually more efficient than several modern food production techniques. They ate well that night, sitting around the fire as the planet's stars emerged overhead. The conversation shifted from survival panic to something approaching comfortable, the shared meal creating a bond that transcended species. "I don't understand," Quillix said eventually, her bioluminescence settled into a content amber glow. "Your species has access to replication technology. You can create any nutritional profile you desire with perfect precision. Why maintain knowledge of these primitive techniques?" Marcus poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. "Because sometimes the ship crashes, sometimes the technology fails, and sometimes you just want to know you can take care of yourself without it." He glanced around at his colleagues. "My grandmother used to say that civilization is great, but it's built on sand if you forget the fundamentals. Fire, water, food, shelter, everything else is bonus features." "A pragmatic philosophy," Vexthal observed, "if somewhat unsettling in its implications about technological reliability." "Your grandmother sounds wise," Thum added. His mass settled into a relaxed puddle near the fire's warmth. "She also said that any meal tastes better if you caught it yourself," Marcus continued. "Not sure if that's wisdom or just her being stubborn, but here we are." The fire crackled peacefully as they sat in comfortable silence, 4 beings from 4 different worlds united by the universal experience of not being hungry anymore. Above them, the unfamiliar stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent to the small drama playing out below. When the rescue ship arrived exactly 41 hours later, the pilot found a scene that made absolutely no sense according to any established protocol. The distress beacon was functioning properly, the crashed ship was documented in the right location, but the crew was sitting around what appeared to be a controlled combustion reaction, consuming thermally prepared organic matter harvested from the local ecosystem. They looked, objectively speaking, pretty comfortable. What in the name of the Transit Authority's comprehensive safety regulations is going on here? the rescue captain demanded, his translator crackling with confusion. Vexthal stood with the dignity of someone who had not in fact just spent the better part of 2 days learning to cook fish over an open flame. We employed Category 5 survival adaptation protocols as outlined in Section 47063 of the Emergency Response Manual. The captain's species didn't have eyebrows, but his translator managed to convey the sensation of raising them anyway. Category 5. That's for extreme survival scenarios requiring the application of primitive technological regression. I've never actually seen it implemented. Well, Quillix pulsed helpfully. Now you have. It was quite educational actually. Did you know that controlled thermal application to organic tissue creates complex flavor compounds through a process called the Maillard reaction? Fascinating stuff. Thum rippled in agreement. I've compiled extensive documentation on pre-replication nutritional acquisition techniques. I'm considering a research paper. The rescue captain looked to Marcus, clearly identifying him as the most likely source of this chaos. And you are? Marcus Webb, xenobiologist, Marcus said, standing and brushing off his pants. I made dinner. The captain processed this for a moment, looked at the fire, looked at the remaining fish smoking on the makeshift rack Marcus had built, and looked back at the human. You made dinner? Yep. They were hungry. There were fish. Math was pretty simple. He employed indigenous terrestrial survival methodologies, Vexthal added, because apparently everyone had gotten very comfortable with technical jargon for the human did some camping. The application was highly effective. We maintained full operational capacity throughout the rescue window. The captain sighed, the universal sigh of someone dealing with a situation that was going to generate so much paperwork. Fine, everyone on board. Medical screening protocols, debriefing. And he paused. Someone's going to have to file an incident report on this. Already done. Quillix chirped, her patches glowing with satisfaction. 47 pages, comprehensive analysis, full documentation of all procedures. I've titled it Thermal Preparation of Aquatic Organisms, a case study in cross-species nutritional acquisition. I'm adding a section on optimal combustion fuel ratios, Thum added enthusiastically. As they boarded the rescue vessel, Marcus took one last look at the fire, now burning down to embers on an alien shore. He'd put it out properly before they left. Of course, leave no trace and all that. But there was something satisfying about knowing they'd survived, that the old skills still worked even millions of light years from Earth. The rescue captain was filing his report as they reached orbit, trying to find the right words to explain to headquarters what had happened. In the end, he settled for the truth, because nothing else would have been believed. Crew of 4 stranded on uncharted planet, replication systems destroyed, emergency rations lost. Prognosis, critical. Outcome, human crew member employed Category 5 survival adaptation protocols, including manual procurement of aquatic organisms and thermal preparation via controlled combustion. All crew members maintained operational status throughout rescue window. Recommend formal acknowledgement of incident. Also recommend cross-species survival training programs, because apparently we've gotten so civilized we forgot how to feed ourselves without machines. He paused, then added a final note. Human in question claims this is normal camping trip stuff. Requesting cultural analysis on human recreational activities, as they appear to double as legitimate survival training, possibly relevant to crew selection for frontier assignments. Somewhere in the galactic archives, this report would join thousands of others documenting humanity's peculiar approach to problems. Future analysts would study it, trying to understand the species that had looked at the entire edifice of technological civilization and decided that yes, that was all very nice. But maybe they should also remember how to start a fire and catch a fish just in case. The universe was vast and often dangerous, filled with species that had optimized themselves into specialized niches, dependent on technology they could no longer function without. And then there were humans who'd brought their camping gear to the stars and considered knowing how to cook dinner without a replicator, a basic life skill. The other species found this attitude baffling, inefficient, and occasionally irritating. They also found it remarkably difficult to argue with the results. Back on the unnamed water planet, the remains of the fire slowly cooled in the evening breeze, a small circle of scorched stones, the only evidence that 4 travelers had stopped there, made dinner, and survived. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore, and somewhere in the clear water, fish swam on, blissfully unaware of their role in galactic cultural exchange. Life, the universe seemed to suggest with its characteristic irony, went on. Sometimes you needed advanced technology and sophisticated protocols to navigate it, and sometimes you just needed a sharp stick, some patience, and the knowledge that humanity's ancestors had been figuring this out for millennia before anyone invented the replicator. Both approaches had their place, but only one smelled as good.